Hello. What I'm about to show you is a computer simulation that demonstrates evolution by natural selection. Imagine this big gray circle on the left to be an isolated island, and the little orange squares to be food items on that island. What I'm going to do is introduce some artificial organisms who would very much like to eat these food items. Let me begin the simulation by clicking on Start button here in the top right. As you can see, we've got a bunch of differently colored organisms that are moving around and eating the orange foodstuff, as well as splitting and reproducing like cells. The food on the island also seems to be growing at regular intervals. The organisms seem to be disappearing after a certain amount of time as well. Let me freeze the simulation to give you a brief explanation of what's going on. When the simulation is running, the food on the island grows at a constant rate, which I can control using this box on the bottom right. By default, it's set to 10 food items every second. Each little organism in the big gray island moves around in a random direction at some constant speed until it detects an orange food item in its vicinity. When it does so, it changes direction towards that food item. If it's lucky, it will reach that food item before someone else does and eat it. Each time an organism eats a food item, it grows slightly in size. You can see that different organisms are of different sizes already. When an organism eats enough food and reaches a certain size, it has enough energy to reproduce asexually. And you might have already noticed some organisms splitting into two. Each organism also has a finite lifespan, and it dies of natural causes after some time. That's why it disappears off this gray island. Let's resume the simulation to see all of this happening. Okay, so you can see the organisms moving around, eating, splitting, and also dying. But where's the evolution, and what do the colors mean? I'll free the simulation again to explain this aspect. Each organism's behavior is determined by its genetic makeup. The genes in the simulation are not like the biological genes in real living things that are responsible for building or regulating proteins, but instead have a made up functionality fit for the purposes of a simple demonstration. Each organism can have a number of genes of three types: red, green, and blue. It can have from 0 to about 250 of each of these genes. In fact, it's this genetic makeup of red, green, and blue that gives an organism its color. For example, some of the organisms in the current frozen simulation are mostly blue in color, while some of them are slightly greenish. At the bottom of the island, you can see a summary statistics about the current population. It says that there are 9 organisms, and on average, the organisms have about 81 red, 85 green, and 104 blue genes in them. I can even use this control on the right to add an organism with a particular amount of red, green, and blue. The amount of red genes that an organism has determines its lifetime. Think of them as immunity to natural disease. An organism with many red genes can live long, perhaps up to a minute or so, while those with fewer red genes die out within seconds. The amount of blue genes determines an organism's speed. So, for example, these blue guys over here are moving around much faster than these green guys. The green genes contribute to the organism's sense of smell. As I mentioned earlier, organisms move in random directions until they can detect food in their vicinity, after which they move towards the nearest food item. The more green genes an organism has, the further away it can detect food items. So these greenish organisms are able to detect food items at a much larger distance than what this bluish organism can. An organism with almost no green genes can eat only the food that it stumbles across by random chance. When an organism reproduces, as you can see, the organisms are splitting after eating a certain amount of food items, its child has almost the same genetic makeup as its parent. However, we introduce some random mutations that vary the amount of red, green, and blue genes by a small percentage. So the child of an organism is almost the same as its parent, but not exactly. This is true in nature as well, since DNA replication is not perfect, and is in fact the random mutations that introduce variation in the population that gives rise to evolution. One last thing. It's not always favorable for organisms to have lots of red, blue, and green genes because having so much functionality makes the organism rather complex. The amount of food items that an organism needs to eat before it can reproduce is proportional to this complexity. which is simply the sum of its red, blue, and green genes. So a dark colored organism, which is more towards the black side, is able to reproduce after eating maybe just one or two food items, while a brighter organism, which has lots of red, green, and blue genes, needs to eat several food items before it can reproduce. And that's clearly visible over here. Um, by Darwin's theory of natural selection, traits that enable organisms to reproduce efficiently end up proliferating in the overall gene pool of the population, since organisms with less favorable traits die out before reproducing and lose out in the competition. This is true in our simulation as well, and by varying the environment, we can see different traits emerging as superior to others because over time they displace less favorable traits. So let me give an example. So here we have an environment in which food is coming in at regular intervals of every zero point 0.5 seconds, in fact, faster than what we saw previously, but only about four food items every serving. And I've been running this simulation for a couple of minutes now, and as you can see, the average gene pool is such that the amount of green genes in the gene pool has shot up. It's about 229 or 230, in fact. Remember, the maximum number of red, green, or blue genes is just 250. So in this population, organisms have a large, very, very large amount of green genes relative to the amount of red or blue genes. And that's because when just a small amount of food is coming in at regular intervals, an organism needs to be able to detect this food at large distances and chase it. However, if I were to increase the amount of food that comes in. So let's say I would say not four, but maybe say 25 food items, but reduce its frequency. So say every 3 seconds or so. What's going to happen is over time, organisms that have a short lifespan are going to be dying out. So I can even reduce this further and say, give me maybe about 40 food items every 5 seconds or so. So organisms that cannot wait 5 seconds to get the next food serving are going to die out. And therefore, over time, what you will notice is the amount of red in the gene pool starts increasing. So organisms with a lot of red in them have been able to survive. Those with lesser amount of red have died out. And I can keep changing the environment to make it more and more drastic. So I can say get maybe around 70 food items, but every 8 seconds or so. And this is going to increase the amount of red in the gene pool even further. Remember that evolution here has not been programmed as such, it's natural selection. The only rules of the simulation are what I've described before. It just happens that organisms with more number of red genes are able to survive better in this environment than organisms with fewer amount of red genes. And therefore, over time, the amount of red in the gene pool increases. It's already about 170. When we began, it was about 80 or so. You'll also notice if I increase the food rate such that food is really plentiful, what would happen is organisms that can move around really fast will be able to reproduce quickly and take over the population. So right now the average in the gene pool is about 115 or so. Notice already that red has gone up to 190 or so in this population. Now I'm going to increase the amount of food coming in to say about 100 food items every zero point 0.1 second. Um, and what this is going to do is cause a drastic rise in the overall population. We've got about 400, 500 organisms already, and a lot of them now have much more amount of blue in them, about 130 on average, and the amount of red and green genes on average in the gene pool over time will reduce. Now, you might ask, why will it reduce? It's not really bad to have red or green genes. Well, that's true, but in this particular environment, it's not really necessary for an organism to have a long lifespan or a really great sense of smell. All it needs to do is move around randomly, very quickly, and it's able to eat enough food and reproduce. An organism that has lots of red and green genes actually is more complex and will require more amount of food to reproduce. And therefore, organisms that have lots of blue but less of red and green are able to reproduce faster. And therefore, if I leave the simulation running for a while, you can already see that the amount of blue in the population has increased. There's much more blue than the red. And if I leave it going around for a few minutes, the blue organisms will literally take over. You can already see the average amount of blue in the gene pool is gone up to 150 or so. Um, and the last thing I would like to show you is that if I change the environment drastically and say reduce it to, let's say, about 50 food items every 5 seconds again, and that's something that we had seen before. But since the competition is so large, since we had a large population, no, none of the organisms are going to be able to get enough food to be able to survive this, and we can see drastic consequences. The population goes down drastically. We just are left with only two organisms, and in some cases, we might even end up with extinction. But fortunately, in this case, our population did not go extinct. We did have one organism with lots of red genes who did survive, and when I changed the environment, this is the guy that's been able to survive and proliferate. So, in the changing environment, we're back with red genes dominating the population. So, I hope this was fun, and if you can run the Java applet, you can see the simulation yourself and play around. And if you find any interesting observations with a particular environment, do let me know. I'll be very interested. Thanks a lot for watching.